Hello and welcome to Peace Shift, a podcast in which we explore what is needed to live in a more peaceful world. With the people I interview, experts and practitioners from the field, we look at cultural change as well as hands-on activism, and we'll discuss the interconnection of war, conflict and environmental destruction. I am your host, Nina Kouvouts, a trainer, peace educator and author. So first of all, thank you again for joining the interview and making time for this. So perhaps you want to introduce yourself a little bit and the work that you are doing, Greta, with World Beyond War.
Yes, thanks so much for inviting me. My name is Greta Zarro and I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War. And World Beyond War is a global nonviolent movement to end all war. Our mission is to abolish the institution of war, which is quite a large mission, and we look at war holistically at all of its multifaceted impacts. So we take an intersectional approach to our work. And we also take a nonviolent approach, as I said. That's very important to us, that we oppose war in all of its forms and violence in all of its forms. And as the organizing director, my role is to provide people with the tools and the training and the resources to be able to run campaigns in their communities and give them that support to be able to organize in basically a distributed model. So we don't have a headquarters, we don't have an office, we all work remotely and people are basically organizing in their communities and working on issues that resonate locally to them. And so I get to connect with people from around the world and provide them that support to be able to organize on these issues.
Mm-hmm. And is your network mostly in the US or in everywhere?
We are global. Yeah, we have people who have signed our peace pledge in 195 countries, nice. Which we're really excited about, and we're always trying to get more members.
Mm. So you try to make something like relevant, organizing in either the US or in Africa or Australia, let's say.
Right. Well, the issue of war impacts every single person on Earth. And when World Beyond War was founded, it was founded as a global movement because we knew that to do something as large as abolishing the institution of war, we couldn't just do it from one country alone. Mm-hmm. And so we knew that we needed this global movement and we needed, basically unified organizing from people all around the world speaking to, how war and militarism impacts them in their communities. And that can take many different forms in each community. So it's kind of this dialectic, I would say, between a global movement, but then, as I was saying, sort of a distributed organizing model where then what that organizing looks like differs on the ground in each community, kind of based on, how militarism is impacting them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but when did the organization start?
We were founded in 2014.
2014. Okay, so kind of recent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
and we were founded because we felt that there wasn't really a strong abolitionist movement. We felt that there wasn't really an organization that was truly looking at the holistic impact of war. And one of our sort of slogans that we say, we don't want to just oppose the war of the day, quote unquote. And we don't want to just get sort of distracted by this war or that war. We want to acknowledge all of those, of course, but we want to also pull back and look at this sort of larger institution. So that was kind of why we were founded, to bring that perspective.
Yes, and then so in this way you all just have to work until that goal is really reached, right? It's not like, okay, now the war in Iraq is over, we're going to oppose the war in Libya. So it's quite obvious what you would like to stop in the world. I guess your answer is gonna be war. But do you also think about things that you want to build?
Yeah, so World Beyond War, we have 3 strategies in what we call the alternative global security system. That is our system that we feel is needed to transition us to a world beyond war. And those 3 strategies are to demilitarize security, number 1. Number 2, to manage conflict non-violently. And number 3, to create a culture of peace. So I think that gets at your question, that it's more than just take away the war system, but it's also to foster this culture of peace, and that can, take many forms, whether it is, including peace in the education field, whether it is including peace in journalism, which we don't see a lot of these days. So it is both that ending the current system, but transitioning, redirecting those funds to healthcare, to climate change, to, ending starvation on Earth. It's really this larger, I would say, paradigmatic shift away from what you could say, is a extractive, militaristic economy towards a regenerative economy.
And are you then taking as a departure point the culture of peace as it was defined by the UN, or?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Are you taking the culture of peace as a departure point from as it is formulated by the UN?
That's a good question. I think that we have our own definition that we lay out in our book, so I would encourage people to go to our website, worldbeyondwar.org, and check out our book, which lays out what I was saying, the alternative global security system. Because, to your question about the UN, we also see some changes that would be needed there, and some reforms that would be needed there. So the book also has a section that provides some recommendations to make the UN better working, or the book also suggests some other models that could be used instead.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm just referring to the definition of a culture of peace, because I've been working with this definition for a game, and they have these 8 areas of a culture of peace, so it would give me like a clear idea of all the aspects that you want to address. But perhaps you said already some things like education and economy, journalism, yeah, and a paradigm shift, which is really a whole different way of thinking, right? That you try to foster.
Right. I mean, and especially, of course, I do live in the U.S., so I'm largely speaking from what I see in the U.S., but, maybe in Western culture more broadly, there is this culture of violence. So that's a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about shifting towards a culture of peace, is changing basically, society's outlook. And that's it permeates into so many different aspects of our lives. We see Hollywood films are funded by the military. We see these very violent video games that are shaping people's mindsets and behaviors. So it really sort of trickles down into so many different levels of our lives. And we're really talking about this larger shift towards what we would call valuing common security. The notion of no one is safe until all are safe, and kind of thinking in this broader framework.
Yeah, great. That connects to a question that I had about interdependence. I think that, especially in the Western societies, as you said, we have a violent culture in which a main idea is to be independent, and it's very individualistic. And to me, it was like very important to understand that our whole world is interdependent on each other, and all the things I can do them only because of other people doing what they are doing, and also because of all the animals and the nature, etc. So maybe you want to comment a little bit on that. How do you find that this concept is helpful if we are to transition to a world beyond war?
Yeah, well, I think that does get at what I was saying earlier in terms of the fact that World Beyond War was founded to be a global movement, and we knew we could not do this, from one nation. It could not just be a U.S.-based organization, for example. So we recognized from the start that it had to be an interdependent, international movement, hearing from everybody on Earth of how militarism impacts them. And relatedly, what I was saying too in our book, how we talk about the notion of common security, this notion of no one is safe until all are safe. And that is a big shift, as you said, from the current very individualistic, competitive mindset, I would say, that society largely has. So yeah, that interdependence is absolutely crucial, and I would say is rooted in our philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm also wondering if, since we're talking about interdependence, do you find also inspiration from other cultures about that, or do you have dialogues around this?
Well, yeah, I would say that that's actually kind of the main point that keeps me inspired. People often ask, what keeps you going? What keeps you hopeful? When these issues that you're dealing with are so enormous and overwhelming, right? And ending all war is such a long-term vision. And so it actually is, for me, the interaction with other cultures, with people around the world, that keeps me inspired, because I realize that, I'm not alone. I'm not just an isolated person doing this work. And it's, of course, fascinating to be able to hear from other people and hear what it's like in their community. So I think that's a really, lucky aspect, I would say, of my job, to be able to, in one day I might be Zooming with someone from, Cameroon, and then Afghanistan, and then Vancouver, and, all over the world. And so that does kind of give me hope.
Mm. Are you generally feeling hopeful?
That's a great question. I guess I would say I am, even though I know it is a very bleak world that we live in. But yeah, just knowing that there are so many people out there that do care about these issues, that are, volunteering their time. I should say all of our chapter coordinators are volunteering to do this. And so yeah, I think that it does show that there is a bit of an awakening. Perhaps we are turning the curve. And our movement is always growing. We're always adding more chapters. So yeah, we keep on going.
Great. Yeah, you should. So maybe you can tell me a little bit more. How do you see the relationship between war and the institution of war, or the culture of violence, and the environmental destruction that we are seeing today? Maybe I won't say too much my own view, and then we can discuss.
Yeah, so the U.S. military especially is one of the biggest culprits here. The U.S. military is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. And so that is something that we do raise awareness to. We have a section of our website that makes those intersections between war and the environment. And unfortunately, we don't see a lot of environmental organizations making those connections. As I said, I did come from a background of environmental organizing, and this was not discussed at all. And I think that, although that's disappointing, it makes sense to me, because, groups have limited time, they have limited funding, they have to focus on their campaigns, and so unfortunately sort of the demands of that can keep us isolated, as we say, sort of keep us stuck in our silos and not broaden out. But World Beyond War, that is one of our core missions, is to make these connections, as we've been talking about, to connect the dots. And so we try to collaborate with other groups beyond the anti-war movement to start a dialogue and to figure out how we can create collaborative campaigns. For example, in Charlottesville, Virginia, we were able to successfully divest the city from both fossil fuels and weapons, and it was a joint campaign, and the city council resolution that passed, made in the language of the resolution, made those intersections and explained why we were doing both the divestment of fossil fuels and weapons at the same time. So that was a really great step, and I think we want to replicate that and do more of that, and show that the U.S. military and the military at large, is one of the leading contributors to climate chaos and environmental destruction. And I think it's interesting because the military is often sort of propped up by this notion that it's keeping us safe, that it's contributing to our security. But I think when we look at even just if we look narrowly at the environmental damage alone, we see that it's not actually helping us. And one statistic is that the U.S. military is among the top 3 polluters of U.S. waterways. And so I use that to say that we are ruining our own country. Even if you don't even care, even if you isolate yourself, you say I don't care what's happening abroad, but even within our country, the U.S. military is among the top 3 polluters of our own rivers and waterways. So I think that just shows the magnitude of the damage that's being done.
Right, and it's kept outside of all the climate treaties also, interestingly.
Yes, absolutely. It's the military loophole, right? It's always excluded from the different agreements, like the Paris Climate Agreement, and that's also been something that we've been, pushing towards and doing petition campaigns to talk about. We need to include military emissions. We had a strong presence at COP26, and are, along with many other groups, have been trying to raise awareness of that fact.
Do you think that besides environmentalists being focused on certain campaigns, that it can be that they just don't even think about the military because perhaps they haven't really critically thought about the institution itself, as you said, it's kind of perceived to keep us safe. Is that a factor as well, or?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, I think, again, especially from a U.S. perspective, but it's not even on people's radars. It's just accepted as the norm. It's completely embedded in our society, and we have so many examples of that. We've already talked about, the militaristic, Pentagon-funded Hollywood films. Another example is, at any major sporting event, you see fighter jets flying over the football field and people clapping, and that's seen as this positive thing. So it's just so normalized that I think it's not even on people's radars. And also I think that it's part of the fact that basically I would say that these things feel very far off, and they feel like very large geopolitical concepts that don't have anything to do with me as an individual, or that's something happening in the Middle East or something like that. And so that's part of our challenge as anti-war organizers, is to show this is actually impacting every single person on Earth, and this has impacts, whether you want to look at the environmental impact, whether you want to look at the economic impact or the human impact. This has so many different impacts, and everyone should be aware of it.
Yes, and so it will be then really a part of this paradigm shift to think about security differently, or?
Yeah, I think that gets to what we were saying earlier of the shift from a militarized security approach to a common security approach, and that's the term that we use in our book. That notion again that I've said of no one is safe until all are safe, and that may be a challenge for some people to accept that, because again, as we said, we do live in this very individualistic, capitalistic, competitive society where people may not care about someone halfway across the globe, and partially that is the result of generations of media that is othering the people who are over there, and sort of perpetuating this stereotype of other countries, or demonizing the other, quote unquote. So we have generations of sort of talking points from the government and from mainstream media that we have to overcome in showing that at the end of the day, we're all human and we have many more things alike than we realize.
Yes, and especially with so many inequalities, it's kind of challenging. So maybe you want to give maybe some examples about individual actions that you take and as well as collective actions. You said already some of it, but maybe you can go a little bit more into it.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing that we do, for example, in our Organizing 101 courses, is kind of a self-assessment process. So we go through like an exercise where people can assess, what are their interests, what are their skill sets, what are they passionate about. And so to your question of sort of what should people do or what can people do, in some ways, I don't want to dictate that. I think it depends on, what resonates with that person and what they're good at, what they're interested in. And one thing that I like to emphasize is that, there are so many ways to get involved. And, an organization needs an accountant. We need, a website designer. We need someone who speaks to the media. We need someone who's comfortable going out on the streets and protesting. We need editors and writers and researchers, and there's so many different ways to get involved. And I think that, sometimes, people can feel intimidated by getting involved in activism because they feel, well, I'm not interested in public speaking, or I'm not interested in going out on the streets, or that's too risky for me. And so I would say, that's okay. You can find your own way of getting involved. There's so many different aspects. So I would emphasize that aspect of it, and also what I was saying earlier, that we don't necessarily dictate what each of our chapters works on, but it really comes sort of organically from what's happening in their community, whether it is our city's investing in weapons, we want to divest our city, or there's a military base in my community, I want to shut down this base, or for example, in Canada, currently the Canadian government is looking to purchase all of these fighter jets, billions of dollars of fighter jets, and so our Canadian chapters are rising up and they're focusing on that campaign. So I think it does come kind of from the bottom up, based on what's happening in all these communities.
And maybe just something that I was thinking about now is, so in the Netherlands there was a strong anti-war movement, mostly, let's say, during the Cold War, so 60s, 70s, and then when the Berlin Wall fell, it's kind of, a lot of people relaxed, let's say. And I can see that this generation now is again very worried with everything that's happening in Ukraine. But I mean, with the young people, and we are almost 1 year later now. In the beginning, yes, people were a little bit scared, but I think that was like kind of short-lived. So how is it in other countries? Do you see that there are more young people involved, and why do you think?
Yeah, well, I would say that the Ukraine war was an interesting situation for us because in some ways it did raise more awareness about war, and suddenly the mainstream media is talking about war and the casualties of war and the refugees created by war, and the mainstream media was totally silent with all of the previous wars before that, right? With the crisis ongoing in Yemen, right? Barely any coverage. And then suddenly with the Ukraine war, there's so much coverage, and that's because, right, the U.S. has a stake in the game geopolitically, right? The U.S. government is anti-Russia, and so it's profitable and in their interests to be highlighting the impact of the Ukraine war. So in some ways, we can use this opportunity to say, look, finally, you see, this is the impact of the institution of war, and this is happening in so many different places on Earth. And so I think that is our job in some ways to leverage this moment to shine a light on how horrific war is. But unfortunately, there is a lot of again, mainstream talking points that we have to overcome that don't necessarily look holistically at war and blame one side. And for World Beyond War, it's very important to us that we look at this larger picture. We look at, what NATO has done over the years, what the U.S. has done over the years that has sort of furthered these tensions and led to this point of crisis. But we also, do not excuse what Russia is doing either. So we take a very nuanced perspective that the very few groups take, where we say, we don't condone either side in this situation. We oppose war making from any country, and so that's a hard stance to take, I think, because I feel that people often think in a black and white way, and it's hard to think in this broader way of showing, basically both sides have committed wrongdoing, and how can we overcome that and achieve a peace. But to your other question of sort of the involvement of young people, I would say that in my experience working with young people and being a young person myself, I think that there is more awareness, I would say, from a different perspective, more like an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist perspective, not necessarily, well, that can translate to anti-war, but it doesn't necessarily always translate. And I think, again, speaking mostly from the U.S., that there's focus more on social justice issues, racial justice issues, but it doesn't always translate into, these are the same, problems, these are the same root problems that are also causing war. And so, again, I think that that's kind of our job as organizers and as World Beyond War, to make those connections and show that this is all sort of one, interrelated, corrupt system.
And is one of the challenges then to kind of make it digestible?
Yeah, absolutely. And, that gets to the earlier conversation of the fact that, these concepts are often seen as this sort of large, geopolitical, complicated situation, something happening far off, halfway around the world. And so, again, I would say that is part of my job as an organizer, is to make it digestible, understandable, sort of break it down into, easy to read fact sheets or other materials. And then, we do a lot of educational work through webinars and podcasts to try to reach a general audience.
Yes. This is just a short side comment. Maybe I see it here. I had this flyer from a Dutch organization, Stop Weapons Trade, which is doing what you say, like this kind of more nuanced stance. And I have a list with 10 rules of thumb, you could say, for war propaganda. Maybe I can send it to you, because I feel that it very much applies to Ukraine.
Yeah, I'd love to see that.
Well, it's also interesting that it's coming up a little bit in the peace movement, the overlap with the, the whole environmental issue, but not so much from the environmental movement.
Right, and I think that's related to what we were saying before of the military being so normalized that it's just overlooked, right? The expression it's often used is, it's the elephant in the room that no one even realizes.
Yes. So we were talking about what you could do, and that there are many things or ways to get involved. But would you also say, maybe you can comment a little bit more about how one can make an impact if you believe that every action can be important, if it's important to do something collectively, or how can you feel that what you do matters in a way?
That's kind of the quintessential question, right? People are always feeling, is this going to make a difference? And in some ways it can feel hopeless, because these issues are so long-term, right? We might not end war in our generation. But I think that we still have to keep going, and personally, everything that I do in my life, I want to do something that matters, that makes a difference. And so that's my conviction, and people may have different, perspectives on life, but I feel that it's important to try, and, to try every moment to do as much as we can. And, from an organizer's perspective, I would say that, part of being a good organizer is setting up short-term goals, intermediate goals, and long-term goals to keep people feeling inspired and to keep that momentum along the way so that people don't burn out. And so, when we're strategizing for a campaign, we think about how can we break it down into these smaller steps so people can have victories along the way, whether it is something very small like, we got 100 signatures on our petition, or 10 people showed up to our meeting, whatever it is, those kind of small goals that we can celebrate. And I was on a webinar with Susie Snyder of ICANN a few days ago, and she was talking of a similar concept, saying that, anytime there's an opportunity that they create a party, anytime there's an opportunity that they can have some kind of celebration, they take it. And she said, anytime we can, we eat cake, just to have that, time together to celebrate and to build community and just to try to keep inspired along the way. Another point that I'll add is sort of my philosophy, I guess, on life is what I call the two-pronged approach. And I think that gets at what you're saying in terms of sort of the individual and the collective. And so the two-pronged approach is that we have to both be... Oh, two-pronged, like two aspects.
Yeah.
Two-pronged, yeah. And so basically that, on the individual level or the community level, we have to be making tangible changes in our lives. And so for me, that means, I live off-grid, I power my home with solar panels, I eat a plant-based diet, try to grow my own vegetables. That can take many forms for many different people depending on their lives. But the point is that I think we have to do these two prongs simultaneously. So one, making these changes on the individual level, making changes in the here and now, even if they seem like small changes, to tangibly, start moving us towards that alternative system. And then the second prong is the sort of policy level changes, that while we're doing these small changes on the individual and community level, that we're also working towards these larger sort of policy and systemic changes that we've been talking about. And so for me, that's kind of how I view life, and I feel that it's really important to be doing both of those things at the same time.
Yes. Sometimes I also, I'm thinking that how recent in a way it was that people were still slaves and, really what seems to us kind of almost surrealistic, no? Like, for example, I visited the Auschwitz, and this was like really, it felt very surrealistic to me. Like, this actually happened, people did things like that. And then to realize that just my grandparents were living in that time, So then it seems to me that, okay, it's really important, even if nothing is going to happen in my lifetime, maybe there will be like my grandchild or great-grandchild, whatever, who says that, well, at least my great-grandmother had this nice idea that we should stop it, and, they made some progress in the long run.
Right, exactly. And I guess it comes down to, in some ways, your personal conviction. How do you want to be remembered? How do you want to spend your lives? And I guess I would make a larger point too, that I feel for a lot of people, they can't necessarily think about these concepts because they're just so focused on the day-to-day life of just trying to survive, and that is not their fault. That is the system that we are in, that is, just massive economic inequality, massive student debt in the U.S., not having universal health care, all of the systemic inequities that we have. So I think it's very hard for people to take the time out of their lives to do activism or to think about these things if they're just struggling to get by. And so that's something that we struggle with, and I don't want to put the blame on the individual, but rather to look at this larger system that is putting people in this circumstance.
Yeah, definitely. And for us who have some time to reflect on it, to try and influence those policies and systemic conditions also, so more people can get engaged. Right, I think we have already answered all the questions. Yeah, only one more. What is your hope for the future?
Well, my hope is a world beyond war, as we've been discussing, and I think that would need to be achieved through the strategies I mentioned earlier of demilitarizing security, managing conflict non-violently, and creating that culture of peace we talked about. So those are the three strategies that I see as necessary to get us towards a hopeful future. And along the way, as we've talked about, what keeps me inspired, what keeps me going is talking with people like you and working with activists around the world and realizing that we are not alone and that so many of us are deeply aware of the issues in our society and are doing the best that we can to collectively work towards that better future.
Are there also, besides seeing that a lot of people want to change things, are there some examples that you are inspired by?
The thing that comes to my mind is divestment. It is something that is very personal to me, I guess. I've always sort of taken a liking to divestment, and it's something that inspires me because I see it as something that is very tangible and actionable, and we've seen real change being made. As I mentioned, the example of Charlottesville, Virginia, that World Beyond War worked on that campaign and was able to successfully divest the city from weapons and fossil fuels. And so I cling to divestment as a positive tactic, and beyond the anti-war movement, we've seen a rising movement in divestment from the prison sector, from private prisons. We've seen a movement of forced divestment from fossil fuels. Historically, the divestment movement against apartheid. So that is something that I kind of keep coming back to as something that works and something that is actionable, and especially when it's much harder to move national bodies, right? It's very hard to get anything passed in Congress or in Parliament, but we can make these very tangible changes at the city level, at the institutional level, such as divesting universities, and even at the personal level, such as changing where we bank or where we put our retirement savings. So I guess I come back to that, and that's one of World Beyond War's core campaigns is divestment from the war machine.
Yeah, and if we look at military expenses, then there's a huge potential in the US, who's spending 10 times more than everyone else, right? I don't know the exact number, but...
Yeah, and that's something that we raise awareness to as well, is if you add up all of the U.S. military expenditures, not just the Pentagon budget, but there's also military expenditures in other departments, like nuclear weapons are actually sort of hidden in the energy department. And if you add up all of these different military expenditures, it's about $1 trillion a year that the U.S. spends on the military, which is about half of all global military spending. So we do recognize that the U.S. is the biggest culprit here.
Yes. I remember reading something in a book, A Business Plan for Peace. Do you know it?
No, I don't know that one.
Yeah, I recommend it, by Cilla Alworthy. And she has this 25 points that can be done with, I think, 2% of the global military expenditure. So it's something similar to what we spend globally on ice cream. I thought that was a very nice image.
Yeah, that's very similar to World Beyond War's billboard campaign that you might have seen. We put up these billboards around the planet, and the message is 3 3% of U.S. military spending could end starvation on Earth, which is just absolutely mind-boggling, and is something that we're raising awareness about. So even if, someone doesn't want to get on board with ending all military, even if they feel we need some part of the military, we say, well, just 3%, or in the case you shared, just 2%.
Yeah, great. So I wish you really a lot of good luck with this really big undertaking, but yes, I do also believe, I'm hopeful myself as well, that one day this doesn't sound like a utopia at all, but just very practical and realistic and just common sense.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, great. Thanks for making the time again.